Your destiny is reflecting in the polished chrome surfaces of the future, waiting for you to step up and claim it. Explore the powerful stories of those who took control of their fate. Click subscribe now and start building your own cinematic legacy starting right here.
The call came on a Thursday afternoon at 2:14 p.m. I remember the exact time because I had just finished reviewing a compliance audit report that my team had spent 11 weeks preparing, and I was about to pour my third cup of coffee. My phone buzzed. It was my direct manager, the VP of Operations. She said the new CEO wanted to see me at 30, no agenda, no context, just be there. I had been the CFO of Hargrove Logistics for 19 years. Let me put that in perspective. When I walked through those doors in 2005, the company was processing roughly $40 million in annual freight contracts. By the time I was called into that meeting, we were managing just under $380 million. I had built the financial architecture from the ground up, the reporting systems, the vendor credit frameworks, the cash flow models that kept us solvent through 2008, through COVID, through the supply chain collapse of 2022. Every single one of those systems had my fingerprints on it. The new CEO's name was Derek Paulson. He had been brought in 8 months earlier by the private equity group that had acquired a majority stake in Hargrove the previous spring. He was 34 years old. He had an MBA from Wharton and exactly 4 years of experience in logistics, all of it on the consulting side, none of it operational. He wore slim-fit suits and used the phrase paradigm shift in what I can only describe as a clinically excessive manner. I put on my jacket, picked up a notepad out of habit, and walked down the hall. Derek was already sitting at the head of the conference table when I arrived. Also in the room, Linda from HR, a woman I had hired personally 12 years ago, and a man I had never seen before who introduced himself only as counsel for the transition. That phrase alone told me everything I needed to know about what the next 20 minutes were going to look like. Derek didn't waste much time. He said the PE group had completed a structural review. He said they were repositioning the executive layer. He said my role was being sunset. Then he slid a manila envelope across the table and said, with the kind of practice detachment you only learn in business school, that the company appreciated my contributions but needed leadership that was built for velocity. I looked at him for a long moment. I asked what specifically that meant. He said, and I want to be precise here because I have replayed this sentence many times since, that the financial systems I had built were legacy thinking wrapped in spreadsheet logic, and that the new direction required someone who understood modern fintech infrastructure. Spreadsheet logic, 19 years, $380 million in managed contracts, a financing model that had literally saved 47 jobs during a credit freeze in 2009. Spreadsheet logic. I thanked him, took the envelope, and walked back to my office. Now here is what Derek did not know, what Linda did not know, what the man who called himself counsel for the transition apparently had not bothered to read. When I had originally joined Hargrove in 2005, the company was a small regional freight broker with ambitions but not much else. The founding owner, a man named Robert Hargrove, had wanted a CFO but couldn't afford market rate. We negotiated. I took a reduced base salary in exchange for two things: a small equity stake that had since been diluted to near insignificance by the PE acquisition, and a clause in my employment agreement, Section 9, Paragraph C, that read as follows: in the event the employee is terminated without cause and without no less than 180 days written notice, all proprietary financial models, forecasting systems, operational frameworks, and related intellectual property developed in whole or in part by the employee during the term of employment shall revert to the employee and may not be used, licensed, or replicated by the company without written agreement and reasonable compensation. 180 days. They had given me an envelope and a Thursday afternoon. I had not thought about that clause in years. Robert had left the company in 2019, retired to Arizona, and the clause had sat quietly in a document that nobody at the PE group had apparently flagged. But I had thought about it 8 months ago, the week Derek arrived, when I watched him walk the floor like he was touring a museum exhibit of things he intended to replace. That week, I had emailed my attorney, a man named Gary, who had drafted the original agreement, and who I had kept on retainer for personal matters over the years. I asked him one question: does Section 9, Paragraph C, still hold under the current ownership structure given the acquisition? Gary called me back within the hour. He said, and I remember his exact tone because he sounded almost delighted, that not only did it still hold, but the PE group's own acquisition documents had explicitly assumed all existing employee agreements as part of the asset transfer. They had, in their rush to close the deal, contractually obligated themselves to honor a clause that was now pointed directly at them like a very quiet, very patient-loaded weapon. I had printed that email, paper-clipped it to a copy of Section 9, and put it in the drawer of my home desk. Then I went back to work and waited. I did not wait because I wanted revenge. I want to be clear about that. I waited because I had spent 19 years building something real, and I was not willing to let it be dismantled without a fight. There was a difference between those two things, and that difference matters. The Friday after my termination, Gary sent a letter to Hargrove's legal team. Not an aggressive letter. Not a threatening one. A factual one. It outlined Section 9, Paragraph C. It identified by name and function 14 financial systems currently in active use at the company. It noted that each of those systems had been built by me, documented by me, and maintained by me, and that under the terms of my agreement, ownership of those systems had reverted to me as of the moment I was terminated without the required 180 days notice. The letter then noted that the company had approximately 60 days to either cease use of those systems or enter into a licensing agreement at a rate Gary described as reflective of their operational value. Gary later told me that the hourly rate he proposed for retroactive licensing came out to just under $12,000 per month. I did not hear anything for 11 days. On the 12th day, my phone rang. It was not Derek. It was not Linda. It was the general counsel of the PE group itself, a woman named Patricia, calling from their offices in Boston. Her voice had the particular flatness of someone who had just spent a week in back-to-back emergency meetings and had not slept enough during any of them. She said she wanted to discuss a resolution. I told her I was listening. She said the group understood there had been an oversight in the transition process. She said they valued my contributions. She said they were open to a range of solutions. I asked her what range she had in mind. She said they could offer a severance enhancement, a meaningful one. She used the word meaningful twice, which told me they were more frightened than they were letting on. I told her I appreciated that and then I would have Gary call her. What followed was 6 weeks of negotiations that I will spare you the granular details of, except to say this: when you are negotiating from a position where the other party cannot function without assets that technically belong to you, the conversation tends to go in a particular direction. The final agreement included a licensing fee paid as a lump sum, a consulting retainer for the transition period, a non-disparagement clause that ran in both directions, and a formal written acknowledgement that my tenure had contributed materially to the company's valuation at the time of the PE acquisition. That last item was not about money. I want you to understand that. It cost them nothing to write it. It was about the record being correct. I will tell you something about Derek. 2 months after my termination, I heard through someone who still worked there that he had stood in the all-hands meeting and announced a new financial transformation initiative. He had brought in an outside consulting firm to build new systems from scratch. I heard the timeline was 18 months and the projected cost was significant. I also heard that during an early implementation meeting, someone on the finance team had tried to pull a forecasting model to answer a vendor question. The system returned an access error. Someone had to explain to Derek, in a meeting room full of people, that the models they had been relying on were no longer theirs to use. I was not in that room, but I understand it was a quiet, specific kind of silence. There is something I have thought about a lot since all of this happened. Not the legal outcome, not the money, not any of the satisfying logistics of watching something like this unfold the way it did. What I have thought about is the conversation I had with Robert Hargrove, the founder, back in 2005 when we were hammering out my employment agreement. Robert was not a sophisticated businessman. He was a hard-working man who had built something with his hands and his time and his willingness to be in the office before anyone else and leave after everyone had gone. He said to me, in that first negotiation, that he couldn't pay me what I was worth yet, but he wanted to make sure I was protected. He said, "If this ever stops working out, I want you to leave with what you built." That clause existed because of that conversation, because Robert believed that the work a person does is theirs, even when they do it inside someone else's company. That is not always true legally. It was not automatically true even in my case, but Robert made it true even in my case. But Robert made it true in writing 19 years before any of this happened. Derek had never met Robert. The PE group had never met Robert. They had bought a company and inherited an agreement they had never read, written by a man whose entire philosophy was the opposite of everything they believed about how businesses should work. I think about that sometimes. How much of what protects you was built by someone who thought about you before you even knew you needed protecting? After the settlement, Gary took me to dinner at a steakhouse in the city. He ordered a bottle of wine that was more expensive than I would have ordered for myself and said, without any particular fanfare, that in 31 years of practice this had been one of his more enjoyable files. I asked him why. He said because the clause was clean, the facts were clean, and the other side had made the single most expensive assumption a legal team can make, that an old contract is not worth reading. I've had a lot of time since then to think about what I would tell someone who was sitting where I was sitting 8 months before that Thursday afternoon. Someone watching a new executive walk the floor of something they built, making mental notes about everything they planned to change. Here's what I would say. Read your employment agreement, not the summary, the actual document. Read Section 9 or whatever the equivalent clause is in your contract. Read the ownership provisions, read the termination conditions, read what happens to the work you do if the relationship ends badly. Most people never read those things. They sign them on day one, excited to start, and the document goes into a folder, and the folder goes into a drawer, and nobody thinks about it again. That is exactly what the other side is counting on. I did not outmaneuver Derek because I am particularly clever. I outmaneuvered Derek because Robert Hargrove was a decent man who believed that the person doing the work deserved to own it, and because I had a lawyer who picked up the phone on a Tuesday morning 8 months ago and told me that decency, in this case, had also been properly documented. The work you do is yours. Make sure someone has written that down. If you have ever walked out of a building carrying an envelope you did not ask for, or watched someone younger and louder and less experienced start dismantling something you spent years building, I hope this was useful to hear, not because the outcome is guaranteed to look like mine, it usually does not, but because knowing what is in your contract is not cynical, it is not paranoid, it is the minimum you owe to every year you have spent showing up and doing the work. That is what I know, that is what I learned, that is what I will tell anyone who asks. I am the guy who built the systems. I am the guy who read the contract. And as it turned out, those two things together were worth considerably more than a manila envelope and a Thursday afternoon.